Russia relies heavily on artillery, and without it, there's a good chance their advances will come to a halt. Their air force hasn't been very active, the number of cruise missile strikes has been decreasing, and their tanks are extremely vulnerable to the large number of anti-tank weapons Ukraine has been receiving. Artillery is really Russia's lifeline, being used to soften up Ukrainian defenses before advancing. But how long can Russia keep up this high rate of artillery fire, especially considering the numerous ammo storage depots Ukraine has been destroying? Well, the numbers are not easy to find. Everyone online just seems to state that Russia has massive stockpiles of artillery rounds, but nothing to back that up or even any mention of any specific figure. To make estimation easier for myself, we'll stick to just conventional, hard-shell tube artillery, not counting rocket artillery, which Russia has a lot of, or the small man-portable mortars. In the US military, infantry is often called the queen of battle. Tanks, aircraft, ships are great, but they can't hold territory. You need boots on the ground, infantry. Russia has a different approach. They've always put a lot greater emphasis on artillery, calling it the king of battle, or, as Stalin put it, the god of war. And he wasn't wrong. During World War II, it's estimated artillery accounted for roughly 2/3 of all casualties. Ever since, the Soviet Union, and by extension, now Russia, has put a lot of emphasis on artillery. That and mechanized forces. In Russia, everything is mechanized. They don't even have light infantry. They want everything flexible and able to maneuver, including artillery. First, some basic background and tactics of artillery that a lot of people miss. You can skip forward to this time here if you're not interested. The use of artillery has changed somewhat over time. In the past, artillery was more often used to soften up enemy defensive lines before an offensive. It wasn't very accurate, so they typically had to target larger areas. It's still often used this way, but as accuracy increased, target of opportunity fire missions became more common. Now, for example, a lot of the artillery strikes we've been seeing are aimed at more specific and smaller targets, even individual vehicles like tanks. Counter battery fire has become much more effective as well. Radars can quickly calculate backward to where an enemy shell came from, and then fire back on it before it can withdraw to safety. But it's still no magic bullet. There are so many variables that can affect accuracy, such as the weather, the changing temperature of the barrel after each shot, the age of the barrel, calibration errors, defects in production, and much more. Because of this, artillery is a numbers game, and there's multiple levels of intensity of artillery fires. Harassment scale attacks could expect to inflict 0 to 10% casualties and/or destruction. This is typically used to keep the enemy pinned down, restrict their movement, and disrupt sleep, meals, resupply, and so on. Next is neutralization, anywhere from 10 to 40% destruction. It's used to degrade enemies' ability to operate effectively in the short term until they can reorganize. Then, maximum intensity, destruction of 50%, sometimes more, and that's used to degrade enemy units in the long term. Each level requires increasing number of artillery shells fired. So, with the exception of the latest and much more expensive guided shells, artillery is still often used in large numbers. And if you look at aerial and satellite imagery of Ukraine, you can see areas are just covered in craters. It kinda looks more reminiscent of World War II, where the entire landscape was just littered from countless artillery strikes than any modern high-tech war the average person might have expected. So to try to get an estimate of how many artillery shells Russia has left, you could first try to figure out how many are being fired. The Guardian recently quoted a Ukrainian official saying they're firing 5,000 to 6,000 artillery rounds a day. He also stated that Russia has 10 to 15 times more artillery than Ukraine. It seems some people then went on to state that that meant Russia was firing 50 to 60,000 rounds a day, which would be more than 1.5 million shells a month. However, that's almost certainly wrong. Russia may have 10 to 15 times more artillery in total, but not all in Ukraine and not all firing at the same rate as Ukraine. The main type of artillery that Russian BTGs use is self-propelled artillery. Again, this goes back to Russia's love of mechanized forces I mentioned earlier. They're faster and they can keep up with other mechanized troops. They're able to set up and fire typically in half the time of towed artillery. It's easier to adjust to hit different targets, quicker to move positions to avoid counter battery fire after, and also gives a level of protection to the crew and the vehicle, making it more survivable. Russia's ground forces have roughly 12 motor rifle or tank divisions, and then around 40 mortar rifle and separate artillery brigades. These consist of roughly 9 artillery batteries per division and 3 per brigade, each battery typically with 6 pieces. That's 1,368 specifically self-propelled artillery as a rough figure. Another source here I found, a paper by Rand, listing specific vehicles in each unit, all adds up to give 1,152 in the ground forces and 228 in the VDV, which gives a similar number of 1,380. So, say, roughly 1,400 to fully equip their formations. It's also worth noting that they have roughly double that in reserve. Russia also has several thousand towed artillery units, but they have not been used or fire on the same scale. Nearly every combat division and brigade has participated in some way in the war, so at any given time, it might be reasonable to assume around 1/3 are in the theater in Ukraine. Most of those would not be actively within range engaging targets every day. Ukraine has also been fighting more asymmetrically, making it more difficult for Russian artillery to find targets to shoot at. Again, a real rough guess, but say 100 firing a day when no large offensive or high-intensity fighting is ongoing. Modern self-propelled artillery can fire around 200 to 300 rounds a day before causing more serious stress and wear to the barrel and the system as a whole, and they're often budgeted around 250 rounds a day on average. Previous wars show that the actual expenditure a day varies, but is often less than half of the budgeted rate, which all leaves us with a number around 10,000 a day. Obviously, that's a real rough number, but it's a number to work with nonetheless. Also, I found an article here trying to estimate artillery expenditures per day using Russian Ministry of Defense figures of fire missions and a lot of estimates. But he came up with a figure around 7,176 per day, also with a wide margin of error. His numbers though are based off a period from May 19th through the 31st. And the level of intensity of combat in Ukraine has varied greatly throughout the course of the war, so it can't simply be extrapolated. But using NASA's firms to judge the intensity based off number of fires, which isn't perfect, but it can give you an approximate idea. Then you can limit those to only fires within artillery range, and then use our estimate per those days, times 7 because it's a week, which gives us about 1.8 million artillery shells fired during the total war. Now again, that has a massive margin of error, but the chart does seem to fit the timeline. Fewer shells were fired in the opening as they were rapidly advancing towards cities. Then, as progress stalled, we see larger use. After that, a big drop as Russia withdrew from the north and repositioned. Then, finally, recently, we see a steady increase as Russia conducts larger offensives in the east. But the real figure is likely somewhere within 50% plus or minus of that number. So, say 1 to 2.6 million. These numbers sound like a lot, but it's important to put in context. During the end of the Korean War, the US and allies were averaging firing more than 2 million artillery shells a month. But that 1.8 million artillery rounds may be a lot or a little depending on the arsenal available. Russia doesn't release any numbers, so we really don't know how many they have. One estimate we could make comes from looking at US inventories. In 1994, it was stated that the US Army had nearly 21 million artillery shells of all types. Around that same time, treaties like the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe and the opening up of former Soviet states revealed that they had roughly 37 million tons of conventional munitions. The US at the time had about 6 million. If that ratio is consistent as to the percentage being artillery shells, it implies that the Soviet Union had nearly 130 million rounds. Another figure could be calculated based on artillery ratio, if you assume that a comparable number of artillery shells were made for each piece. At the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union had roughly twice the number of artillery as the US, which could imply an arsenal at the time of 42 million artillery shells. But the Soviet Union and Russia have always held on to larger stockpiles of weaponry, ever since they were invaded by Germany in World War II, so they likely have higher reserves. So it's likely that the late Soviet Union artillery round stocks, therefore, probably were somewhere between 75 to 150 million. That's 30 years ago though. Since then, both sides have destroyed large amounts of weaponry. The current total stockpile the US has is kept secret, but they use a somewhat complex formula to calculate how many are needed, or TAMR, the Total Army Munitions Requirement. It takes into account estimates based on ongoing operations, homeland security, forecasting future threats and warfare, and the number needed to sustain operations for a period of time, munitions needed for at least 6 months of training, testing, and more. But based on force structure, the production rates of new rounds, and other sources, the US likely has somewhere between 3 and 4 million artillery shells total. The US has also sent around 250,000 155mm rounds to Ukraine. Russia also demilitarized a large amount of its conventional munitions in the 90s, however, often lacking funds to properly dispose of it. Russia also sold a lot of its surplus ammo for very low prices, or even gave it away for free to other nations, and threw the rest in storage. Also, a sizable percentage of their stored munitions were apparently completely obsolete, some of them even dating back to the early 1900s. Economic troubles also led to poor storage conditions. While technically shells are typically stable and will last indefinitely, things like the fuses, primer, lack of proper climate control such as the temperature and moisture, dirty environments, poor manufacturing qualities, and other things can impact the shelf life and even make them unstable or just unusable. It seems every year or so a news story will appear of a World War II munition being found in a populated area. It didn't explode in all these years since, but the area is often evacuated as it could go off when handled. But considering dismantled and transferred munition figures, obsolete ones, along with production levels since, another real rough estimate puts the figure around 15 million artillery shells in storage. How many of them are safe and usable is another issue, and could just depend on safety standards in Russia. That could all leave an arsenal between 5 to 15 million usable artillery rounds. So, from that, subtract the 1.8 million estimated to have been fired. If they continue in Ukraine at the same rate, that would leave them, at worst, enough to last till March 2023. And that's not even counting new rounds that could be produced in the meantime. So, how many rounds can Russia build to refill their stocks? Well, again, we can look at the US as they're more transparent. The 2023 defense budget is stated to procure 92,517 155mm and 21,768 105mm rounds, of which about 100,000 of those have an explosive warhead, the rest being training, smoke, or illumination rounds. This number is smaller than normal as the US has been cutting back with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and they've been procuring extremely accurate and much longer range rounds such as the XM1113. It's rocket assisted, nearly doubling its range to 40 kilometers, and has a precision guidance kit, giving it the ability to precisely hit small targets such as individual vehicles. It's an incredible round, but at $8,300 each, it's almost 10 times more than the $840 M795 round. So it's eating up a lot more of the budget, but if it can accurately strike a target that would normally require 10 or more rounds to hit, then it's worth it. But back to Russia. Russia is really good at building ammunition. Things like rifle rounds and artillery shells are relatively simple and require few sophisticated electronics or materials. Everything they need can be found domestically. Therefore, things like sanctions will not directly hurt production, unlike missiles, aircraft, tanks, etc. Their production capabilities exceed that of the US. Manufacturers, such as Techmash and others, are believed to be able to scale up production to well over 1 million rounds a year. But one factor I didn't discuss is the several forward ammo depots that Ukraine has been destroying recently. The actual number of munitions Russia is losing in these strikes is negligible, each one consisting of a few days' use of artillery at most. However, it's important because it greatly complicates Russian logistics. Supplying every artillery unit with all this ammunition is incredibly difficult. Artillery shells are large and heavy, and supplying thousands of them each and every day to each location is an absolute logistical nightmare. In fact, artillery rounds can, and they often do, account for half of the total weight of all supplies in a war. Russian 152mm artillery shells weigh 43.5 kilograms each, so say 50 including the crate. 10,000 a day would be 500 tons. 5-ton capacity trucks means that's 100 deliveries each and every day, and could be a lot more when ammo is destroyed and during a major advance. Due to Ukraine striking these depots, Russia will have to adjust. They rely mostly on rail to deliver supplies, including these artillery shells, into the theater. From there, they're transferred to an ammo dump, where trucks will come to pick up supplies and bring them back to the forward deployed artillery units. Because of this, they need to be as close to the front as possible. But now to protect them, they're going to have to be moved much further back, out of range of Ukrainian weaponry. This means trucks will have to travel further, driving hours through a war zone, which requires more fuel and maintenance. Also, increased resupply time means less trips that these trucks can make a day. We've even seen Russia resort to using civilian vehicles to transport munitions. And, as boring as it might sound, logistics is what makes or breaks a military at war. Whoever can get more munitions and supplies to their troops often ends up winning. So, in the end, it may not matter how many artillery shells Russia has, but whether they can continue to get them to the front where they're needed. Without artillery, or even a slowdown, Russia is going to have difficulty continuing to advance, especially due to their apparent lack of air superiority, which in and of itself is a whole other mystery, and could be a fun topic to explore in a future video. But the lack of air power, the increasing shortage of precision-guided cruise and ballistic missiles, and the chipping away at Russian artillery takes away a lot of the advantages Russia has over Ukraine. And it could also give Ukraine the ability to assemble and conduct counteroffensives to take back some of the land it lost. That is, unless Russia figures out how to adapt, which, along with logistics, is another extremely important factor in war. As the saying goes, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Just as Russia focuses on mechanized forces to be flexible, they need to be flexible in their overall battle plans as well if they want to win. And then finally, you might have noticed, no sponsor this week. With the economy slowing down, advertising is a quick and easy way for companies to cut costs. And my livelihood is based off advertising revenue. So let me advertise my own Patreon. If you're in the position to do so, it really goes a long way to help support the channel there. The research for this was a lot. Here's some of the notes I scratched down, half of which I didn't even end up using. But I really love it, and I want nothing else to continue creating this content. Anyway, thanks for watching.